Hi, this is John Potter and welcome to session 4 of Leadership in Action. And in this session we're going to have a look at the functional and action-centred approaches to leadership development.
In this session 4 of Leadership in Action, we're going to have a look at the functional and action-centred approach to leadership development. The functional or action-centred approach to leadership was really a reaction to what was being thought was an over-scientific approach to leadership, and was brought into being by Professor John Adair, who was one of my predecessors at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. And he asked the question, is leadership about what the leader is or what the leader does? And he developed his functional approach really based on some ideas which came from group theory. Effective groups seem to take care of the needs of the task, accept that they have a group identity, and that at the same time accept that individuals have their own needs, strengths and weaknesses. And John Adair set out to observe how successful leaders operate in this small group situation. So, there seemed to be an emergent issue in the 1960s with regards to leadership, possibly as a reaction to this scientific work being carried out on leadership in the USA by the universities of Ohio, Michigan, and other institutions, and of course by a number of psychologists and other researchers such as Bernard Bass, Fred Fiedler, and a whole raft of people, and this started to generate the feeling that leadership and really research into leadership was becoming too, quotes, scientific. Now John Adair, who was a senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, a lecturer in military history, not psychology, he felt that the key to understanding effective leadership and leadership behaviour was the extent to which the leader satisfied the needs of the situation in which they were leading. And those leads fall into really three categories. Adair used the group theory approach of satisfying task, team and individual needs as an investigative tool, and he observed many team leadership situations during the leadership development processes carried out at the Royal Military Academy. At the same time, he also maintained contacts with government, with private sector organisations such as ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries at the time, and also the church. And the reason for this was ensure that his leadership work was not just confined to the work and the world of the military. And for an interesting and comprehensive perspective of the work of John Adair, it suggested that you read the book John Adair, Fundamentals of Leadership, edited by Gosling, Case and Witzel. It contains a number of articles by people who've been very influenced and exposed to the work of John Adair, and really gives a very, very rich picture of the contribution that John Adair has made with his functional approach, or action-centered leadership as it tends to be called today. So, before moving on from slide 2 to slide 3, give some thought to the following study question. In your view, which is more important, what a leader is or what a leader does? So, a question that was being asked in a number of places was, is there such a thing as leadership theory? Now, John Adair was not a scientist, and like many of his colleagues in the military was suspicious of leadership models and quick fixes to the challenge of leadership. He's observed many other approaches to understanding leadership and still remains true to the core principles of functional or action-centered leadership. Until he created the three circles approach, the military and many other organisations had relied primarily on the qualities approach and experience, taking the view that they did not want to overcomplicate leadership with models that were too scientific. So, like many people in the military and large corporations particularly, John Adair had developed this healthy distrust of scientific and psychological approaches to leadership, and particularly to complex leadership models. His objective was really to demystify leadership by shifting the emphasis from the characteristics of the leader to really the actions that the leader could take to really enable the team to be more effective, or the people who are being led to be more effective. And he was interested in these actions the leader could take to actually satisfy the needs of the task, the needs of the team, and the needs of individuals within the team. and the leader satisfies these three sets of needs by carrying out certain leadership functions which address the needs in specific terms, and we'll discuss these functions later in this session. Now, there are many benefits to John Adair's relatively straightforward approach. Firstly, the concept can be taught in a relatively short period of time. In the early days, military personnel were introduced to the model in a 1-hour session and then debriefed as to their performance after field exercises using the three-circles approach as a model. The second benefit of Adair's three-circle approach is that it integrates both leadership and management actions, and the leadership management debate has been an important issue in leadership theory, particularly in the 1990s. And Adair's leadership functions include both leadership and management actions. We discuss this later in the session. The third benefit of Adair's approach compared to a complex theoretical model is that the functions may be taught to a wide range of individuals. No longer was leadership just for the gifted and those of high social standing, but a set of skills which could be taught to almost anyone in a leadership position. As such, Adair's model paved the way for a spectral shift in the ability of the average manager to lead others. The main criticism of Adair's model tends to centre around the issue that the model is focused on the team leadership level rather than the operational or strategic levels, although in recent years he has addressed the issue of strategic leadership in some detail, and we'll revisit this issue in a later session. And then another point, not often discussed in relation to Adair's work, is that the people aspect of leadership is, in his functional approach, split into two separate components, rather than, if you like, just task versus people, which is the way that most of the American approaches up to the time, the behavioural approaches, were actually working. The task in Adair's model is 1/3 of the focus, and the people aspects comprise 2/3 of the process. Well, I'll discuss this further in the next slide, but before we move on, please give some thought to the following study question. How do you think Adair's approach to leadership compares with those suggested as far back as the time of Socrates, Xenophon, and Plato in session 1? Moving on to slide 4, we can see the roots of functional leadership, the work of John Adair, presented graphically. The best known representation of Adair's functional or action-centered leadership approach is the set of three circles depicting the three sets of needs. Now, given this framework, it's relatively easy for a leader to quantify all three sets of needs in some detail. As mentioned in the previous slide, at first sight it would appear that the people aspects dominate the situation, with 2/3 of the attention of the leader being on satisfying the people needs related to team needs and individual needs, and 1/3 on satisfying the task needs. However, these circles represent the attention put into each area of needs, and so are not static in size, and they will fluctuate in size depending on the leadership task at hand. In the next few slides, we will note the differences between task, team, and individual orientated leaders. So, your study question for this slide, slide 4, is this. In your own experience, have you noticed that effective leaders, particularly in team or front-line situations, seem naturally to take care of the needs of the task, build a team spirit, and remember that the members of the team are all individuals? In slide 5, we see a task-orientated leader. This slide depicts a task-orientated leader placing their emphasis on satisfying task needs rather than team or individual needs. With this type of leader, team spirit can suffer as little effort is often made to build up group spirit or morale, as the emphasis is constantly on the tasks, targets, and outcomes. Furthermore, individuals often feel isolated and unappreciated. In basic terms, as suggested by leader-member exchange, which we will discuss later in this series, individuals do need to feel that their individual needs are taken into account by the leader, that they are significant, part of something worthwhile, and that there is a degree of certainty about their own position. So, the study questions for this slide are as follows. Have you experienced working for a task-focused leader? How did it make you feel in terms of significance and self-esteem? Just give some thought to that question before moving on to the next slide. In slide 6, we see the drawing rearranged to show the situation for a team-orientated leader. So this slide shows a team-orientated leader, and this type of leader tends to be very relationship-orientated and enjoys creating the high-performance team as a unit. However, individuals often feel that they're just a number rather than an individual person, and the task performance can suffer due to a lack of focus on task outcomes, as the focus tends to be all about the team interacting with each other and developing team spirit. So, giving some thought to the study questions for this team-orientated leader shown in slide 6, have you experienced working for a leader who is team-focused? If so, what was the productivity of the team like? And did individuals feel valued or simply part of the team? In slide 7, we see the drawing reconfigured to show an individual-orientated leader. So this slide depicts an individual-focused leader, one who creates individual relationships rather than focusing on creating a team spirit or task outcomes. Certainly task outcomes for the team as a whole. Whilst it can enable individuals to feel very important and significant, it often lacks the synergy and group dynamism that is created in an effective team. It can also lead to the generation of politics within the team. So, the study questions for this particular slide, slide 7, what do you think are the benefits of an individual-orientated leader, particularly in a high-tech digital world environment? How can that leader redress the balance and satisfy both task and team needs? So, how do we go about satisfying this set of 3 groups of needs? Well, John Adair set out to do this by proposing 8 leadership functions, and those functions were defining the task, planning, briefing people, controlling, evaluating the outcomes and the progress, motivating people, organising people, and setting a good example. So these 8 functions were created in order to satisfy the 3 sets of needs related to the task, creating a team, and handling individuals within the team. Now the list does vary sometimes in terms of the order of the items depending on which of his books you read. However, we will choose for our purposes the list in his book Effective Leadership, produced in 1983. And in this book, Adair suggests that the leader needs to define the task effectively. He or she needs to plan what is needed to be carried out in the way of work. The leader needs to be effective at briefing the people in the team and telling them about things and keeping them up to date, and then controlling the way in which the work is carried out. Now, the control issue is an interesting one in today's empowerment terms, so perhaps we might add, and I quote, give appropriate control when needed, close quote, to this function, because we want to avoid a possible over-military style of leadership, of bossing people around. Now the other 4 functions in the list are evaluating performance, motivating individuals, organising people and other resources, and setting a good example. Now, as John Adair has moved on with his writing, in his book Strategic Leadership, produced in 2002, his list becomes firstly planning, initiating, controlling, and then supporting, informing and evaluating in one section of the book, and then in the summary of the chapter on leadership functions, it reverts to the idea of defining the task, planning, briefing, controlling, supporting, informing and reviewing. And in this time it actually leaves out the idea of the leadership example as an important issue. Well, the point here is that there is not one version of the list that is the correct one, but that all the various functions have a part to play in different situations. So the study questions for slide 8 are these. Which of the 3 versions of John Adair's leadership functions appeals to you most, given your particular area of work? How well would you evaluate your performance at each of those functions in the list that you've chosen? And then would you feel it appropriate to blend all 3 lists together to produce your own list of personalized functions which would work best for you in your leadership in action situations? In slide 9 we focus on one of the great benefits of John Adair's functional or action-centered approach to leadership. This idea of creating a spectral shift in leadership capability. And the whole point about John Adair's approach is that the individual leadership functions can be taught and developed in a given individual. Skill development can take place relatively easily within each of those 8 functions. And the functions and how well they are performed can form a basis for leadership assessment and development. Well, at the turn of the 20th century, the great man or great person theories prevailed, although it has to be said, particularly in today's politically correct world, the idea of great man theories is something of a misnomer. What we're really referring to is the great person approach, because throughout history there's been a wide range of effective female leaders, for example Elizabeth I. And the idea of the great person approach was that in terms of leadership, some people had it and some didn't. In many cases it was suggested that people were born to lead, were encouraged to take leadership positions by their social upbringing and school environment, and that leadership ability was inherited rather than developed. Whilst this approach is appealing to many on a superficial level, it does have many problems. Firstly, it underplays the importance of technical and professional knowledge which earlier observers such as Socrates, Xenophon and Plato had identified, and in some cases, including the military, it led to the concept of the buffoon leader who people would follow for reasons of position and rank rather than belief in the leader's ability to operate effectively as a leader. And there were many attempts to identify specific leadership traits or characteristics, including such factors as courage, enthusiasm, stamina, physical fitness, humility, and so forth. And the identification of such traits, as we've already seen, is a highly subjective process with little scope for accurate measurement. And also the qualities and traits approach on its own tends to lead to stereotyping problems, where people who are engaged in leadership selection tend to favour candidates like themselves. There is little agreement on the definitive set of leadership qualities and traits, as we've already seen, although the many lists of similar institutions, such as military and police academies, have listed many things which overlap, and they tend to overlap on the issues they identify quite commonly. And it's very difficult to measure qualities and even more difficult to develop specific qualities to order, although it has to be said that the subjective view of leadership quality is still firmly held by many people on the basis that leadership potential is difficult, if not impossible, to reduce to scientific terms. Thus the world of leadership study moved on to consider the importance of the situation to the leader's effectiveness, and then it moved on to the whole business of John Adair's functional approach. So before thinking about situations in leadership, give some thought to the following study questions. Do you think that leaders are born rather than made? To what extent do you think that leaders are born rather than made? And how does your answer impact on the idea of leadership development? Moving on to slide 10, John Adair's approach with the functional or action-centered leadership idea had quite an impact on leadership selection and leadership development processes, particularly creating situations, either indoors or outdoors, both looking at leaders and trying to select those who had potential leadership ability, and then in developing those abilities. Leadership selection issues became important, particularly the 1960s onwards, in all sorts of organisations, and the idea of the difference between an emergent leader and a designated leader, and the sort of situations that could actually identify those two characteristics of individuals became significant. The command task concept started to grow in popularity, which is a situation that you give people a problem or something, for example, a vehicle with a wheel that's come off and only 3 wheel nuts, and the wheel is not safe if it's only held with 3 wheel nuts. So what the leader has to do is come up with a common sense approach to doing that sort of task. Very, very interesting, out of doors, quite stimulating. And then tabletop exercises, which of course could be run indoors with much greater safety in most cases, and of course commercial organisations warmed to that idea. Tabletop exercises became very important, based on Lego and building bridges and so on and so forth. But the military and the police organisations and other organisations still held on, and still do hold on to this day, to the idea of arduous physical approaches, partly because it develops resilience as well as pure leadership ability. Well, many writers on leadership, such as John Adair and also Warren Bennis, have pointed out the importance of the interaction of the leader and the situation. See Session 7 for a discussion of some of Warren Bennis's ideas on the differences between leadership and management. It's an interesting, although a rather false, differentiation, but one that is well worth considering. A situation in which one leader may excel may be seriously career limiting as far as another individual is concerned in the leadership position. It's often said that leadership effectiveness is the product of the person and the situation, and we can represent this in pseudo-mathematical form with the equation LE equals P times S. Now, it's important to realise that what works in one context, say a military culture, may not work so well in another culture, for example a bank. This is something that ex-service personnel have to consider when leaving the strongly defined and controlled culture of the military. In particular, the attributes of a leader in combat may sometimes be interpreted as rather toxic in a non-military civilian environment. However, it does seem useful to place potential candidates for leadership positions into various assessment situations to see how their approach compares with that of their contemporaries. And the command task concept of giving the candidate a situation, an objective and a group of people to lead has gained many supporters in a wide range of organisations and situations. And these command tasks may be tabletop exercises or operated outdoors, even in harsh conditions. So before moving on to the end of this particular session, please give some thought to the following questions before finally moving on. Study questions are these. Can you identify the required leadership skills of a military leader? If so, how well would these translate to the civilian environment? Now, to close this session 4, a few words about the bibliography. If you would like to look at the work of John Adair and gain an impression of some of the opinions of his work, have a look at the book Fundamentals of Leadership, edited by Gosling, Case and Witzel, published by Palgrave in 2007. There are many articles by many people who've been influenced by John Adair, and it's a very, very good, pretty good view of the whole of his work, the benefits and sometimes the shortcomings. His two books, Effective Leadership 1983 and then Great Leaders 1989, are very useful in building your foundation of thought on leadership, and then moving on to the strategic level. The book Effective Strategic Leadership, published in 2002, is very much a core text for people studying strategic leadership. And then just to widen it and think about other approaches, particularly this leadership management debate, have a look at Warren Bennis's book called On Becoming a Leader. Although it was published in 1998, it's still pretty current and has some very, very useful concepts. So that's the end of session 4, and I look forward to speaking with you in session 5. Thank you.